preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Tonight's speaker, Susan Estrich, will give a talk on sex and politics, the state of women in America, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. She's a woman of firsts, the first woman president of the Harvard Law Review and the first woman to head a national presidential campaign. She's committed to paving the way for women to assume positions of leadership. The long list of positions that she's held in politics is impressive and varied, but she's currently the Robert Kingsley Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Southern California and writes for USA Today, American Lawyer, and the LA Times. She also appears frequently on television news programs such as Firing Line, 60 Minutes, and Fox News. She's the author of 4 books, most recently, Sex and Power. She also serves on the Ethics Commission of Los Angeles and was appointed by the president to serve on the National Holocaust Council. Please welcome Susan Estrich.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yes. I want to talk tonight about sex and power and why women need more of both. I love telling stories, so let me start with a story. I was recently invited to one of those elite conferences of major corporate types. This one happened to be sponsored by Talk Magazine and Payne Weber, and it was up in Santa Barbara. And I got the letter in the mail, and it said, please join 150 of the most interesting and important people in the world. And then it listed 12 men as the come on, Barry Diller and Michael Eisner and Jack Welch. And I said to my secretary, well, they must have gotten to 132 and decided they needed 18 women. But anyway, far be it from me to say no. I said yes, and I went up to Santa Barbara. And in fact, it was 200 people, 198 of us white people, and 2 non-white people, which for starters I found a little surprising. And there were maybe 30 women there, 35 women, impressive women, most of whom had no speaking parts. So the first night, right? So the first night we heard from Jack Welch, the chairman of the board of General Electric, and Lou Dobbs, and it was, quite fine. And the next morning they had this panel discussion on business and the media. And of course, I'm newly single, and I go to this event, and as is typical of these things, I say, perhaps I'll meet some fabulous single men, and instead I meet some wonderful women. There may not be women at these events, but they're always the most interesting people. So I'm sitting in the front row because we're at this session, and these 3 other women and I decide we got to make sure they see that we're here. Right? So we'll sit right in the front, unlike what I used to do in law school classes. And about 55 minutes into this session, in which the men are all sitting around complaining about how the media covers them. I mean, at one point, Jack Welch from the audience is complaining about how General Electric is covered. I turned to the woman sitting next to me and said, did I miss the point where he owned 3 networks? But anyway, he's complaining away, and they're complaining about each other, and busy complaining, fetching and moaning. And finally, about 55 minutes into this, I turned to my friend, my new friend. I say, well, I guess I'm the skunk at the garden party. She said, isn't that why you were invited? I said, I guess so. So I raised my hand, and I think of myself as the nice feminist. I think of myself as the feminist who smiles and is nice and polite. So I have my hand in the air, and Harry Evans, who's the, Tina Brown had helped convene this, her husband, former publisher, editor, Random House, all that good stuff. Great guy. He sees me. He says, Susan, in the front row. Yes, hard to miss. I stand up, and I don't get nervous very much. I mean, I work for Fox News. I take on jerks every day. I mean, this is what I do for a living. But I'm a little, skunk at the garden party. I've got 10 CEOs in the audience, and I'm about to stand up and do what everybody hates to hear. We're all white. There are no women, one of those things. So I stand up on my best behavior, and I try to do it substantively. I stand up and I discuss the AOL-Time Warner merger. Now, I don't know how many followed that merger, but there was a lot of talk about who was going to run the largest communications company in the world. And would it be the men from Time, or would it be the men from AOL, or the men from AOL, or the men from Time? So when the organizational charts came out, last year. They got a lot of attention. And they listed 25 people who were going to run this new company. And need I say that every one of the 25 were men. And I pulled the clips, the newspaper stories, from every newspaper and news organization in the country. And I'm saying this to the fellows very nicely. And I said, and when I pulled the clips, not only was it the fact that every one of the 25 people on that organizational chart was a man, but not one single story made reference to that fact. They all counted up how many were from Time and how many from AOL, and what the significance of that was and why, but not one single story mentioned the fact that all 25 were men. So I pause a little bit, and I then smile in my nicest smiling feminist way, and I say to the 7 men on the stage, I say, now from a certain perspective where I sit, said I, you all look sort of alike to me. I thought that was nice. I said, so can you tell me how you address issues of race and gender in your coverage of business? And Harry Evans said, good question. He said, anybody want to take it? And Don Hewitt, who I like enormously, the founding producer of 60 Minutes, said, I'll take that. He said, that's easy, said he. He said, I have Leslie Stahl on the air. There was a pause, and Harry said, good answer. Next question. Now, at this point, I had everybody from Georgette Mossbacher to Esther Dyson to Ann Richards applauding for me. You know, in the year 2001, that when you've got everybody from Georgette Mossbacher to Ann Richards applauding for the same thing, you're in the Stone Age, all right? Those women should be agreeing on nothing. And the fact that we are at the place where the answer is, I've got Leslie Stahl in the air. And what was worse, Leslie being an old friend of mine, was she was in the audience too, and she didn't have a speaking part. Anyway, afterwards, I went into the ladies' room, and in the ladies' room, I saw Barbara Streisand and Donna Karan, kind of a cool ladies' room. And they both came up to me and said, good for you that you stood up and said something. I said, well, it's important. And, you know, here we have 2 days of panels. And there were no women with speaking parts. I mean, Ann Richards doesn't have a speaking part. How can you not give Ann Richards a speaking part? Christiane Amanpour, only a moderator. I mean, even women I don't like don't have speaking parts. Ariana Huffington's got no speaking part. I mean, who says to Ariana, don't talk for 2 days, right? Anyway, about 3 or 4 days later, an item appeared in the New York Post on page 6 that made me laugh tremendously. It said that Barbara Streisand, I should add that there were no Asians, no Hispanics, and no black men. I had made that point as well. Anyway, the item appears on page 6. It says that Barbara Streisand was very upset about the absence of women and minorities at this conference. And then it has this line at the end saying, Susan Estrich was also upset. I sat down, and the point of this story is that the panels were put together by a young woman. And the conference was co-chaired by a woman. And yet it had never occurred to them that it was really important that this was in effect, an opportunity for informal networking, an opportunity to walk in the room and sit down with a CEO, an opportunity for women who were there, if given a speaking part, to shine and impress people. And I sat down with the young women afterwards, and they said, gee, it never occurred to us. We were going to have a woman on this panel, but she couldn't make it. And I said, well, there were a lot of others who could have done it. I said, and, you know, in the future, I said, just think how nice it would have been to give women the opportunity to impress the men who were in that room. And they said, how interesting. I said, yes, next year, either I won't be invited at all, or I'll do the panels for you, and we're waiting to see. The point of the story is that the numbers of where women stand when you get to that rarefied level of the top in America today, the numbers stink. And they stink, and they're as bad as they've been for the last 20 years, and it's not just a pipeline problem. It's a problem of conscious and unconscious discrimination. It's a problem not only of men not thinking, but too often of women not thinking, of everybody operating on the same old assumptions that continue to hold women back. Let me just give you some numbers just for illustration. 20 years ago, there were 2 Fortune 500 companies in America that were run by women. Do you know how many there are today? 2! We've gone from 2 to 2. If you look at the Fortune 500 and you look at the top 5 officers in each of those companies, a pool of 2,500 people, how many of you think at least 100 of them would have to be women? That would be 2.5%. Right, they aren't. We have been jumping up. These numbers are just flying skyward from 62 to 67 to 73. We are still below 3% when it comes to top earners. And what's worse, the women in that rarefied group make less than the men. Not only do they make less than the men, but you know that story that says women make less because they're in staff jobs and the guys are in line jobs? Wrong again. The women in the line jobs make less than the guys in the staff jobs. You look at boards of directors. Now, we've gotten to the place where, we're up to 10%. We call this victory. 90% men, 10% women. But we're flat at 10%. And what's worse, among inside directors, the people who actually run the companies, 1.1% are women, 98.9% are men. You look at the Fortune 1000, the numbers are actually worse. When you go from the Fortune 500 to the Fortune 1000, the percentage of companies with no women on their boards increase. I wrote this book about sex and power. It had a sentence in it that said that, everybody thinks high tech is so terrific. 95%, I said, of the venture capital in this country last year went to men. And my editor said that can't possibly be right. I mean, we're talking about high tech. Got to be a lot of women out there. So I sent my male research assistant out to double check the figure. 98. My anecdotal experience, I went back to my Wellesley 25th reunion about 2 years ago, and that's really what started me in pulling these numbers. And the reunion got a lot of attention because it was Hillary's 30th and it was Madeline's 40th, and there were all these stories saying, it's the power women are getting together at Wellesley, which was just delightful. But I have to tell you my experience. My experience was that I had never met so many real estate brokers in my life. And nothing against real estate brokers. But the reason these women were real estate brokers was because so many of them had done what they thought they were supposed to do, which is they had gotten married, they had raised children, they had volunteered in the community, they had been pillars of the community. And then, as many of us discover, that as your kids get older, they want less of your time and more of your money. And these women went to go back to work. And unlike, say, climbing around in a bunker, which is considered a highly valuable experience for corporate America, dealing with hysterical people in the middle of the night. I mean, I believe, as the mother of 2 children, that I have learned valuable coping skills. I now do a lot of corporate consulting, which I consider to be another form of babysitting, only higher priced. And I have learned many valuable coping skills as a mother. But you can't walk in there and say, really, I'm good at dealing with hysterical and irrational people who make ridiculous requests, and I can handle them in the middle of the night on no sleep. No one gives you credit for that. And what women find, and many of you may have found this, is you're 45 years old, you walk into an interview, somebody says, where have you been for 15 years? And when you say you've been holding up the community and raising children and doing all those wonderful things, they smile nicely and think, who wants to hire someone's mother? And it is very difficult because these 45-year-old women and 50-year-old women, some of us, are confronting a mixture of sex and age discrimination that makes it very difficult. It's not that the mummy track is a detour, it's that it becomes a dead end. In the legal profession, I've been teaching law for 20 years. We now are teaching classes in which half our students are women. But in the 20 years I've been teaching, I've seen the numbers go way up in terms of how many women are at the bottom. If you look at the latest studies out last week and the week before, the number of women who are partners in major American law firms is actually decreasing in absolute numbers. I mean, consider 20 years after women invaded law schools in America, going to a third to 40% of the class, we now have the number of women who are succeeding to become partners actually decreasing. What's going on? I want to identify a couple of factors, and I can do profession by profession. You look at medicine. What I did in collecting numbers, engineering, accounting, was I looked 20 years ago to see what percentage of the graduating classes were women, and then I jumped 20 years into the future. So you look at medicine, and you see classes of a third to 40% women, and you look at department chairmen, and you see 6% women. You look at accounting, and you again see 30 to 40% women 10 to 20 years ago. The number of women partners in the big 8%. I mean, engineering, really awful. In academics, women make less, get tenure less, publish less, earn less, get promoted less often, are more likely to be in part-time jobs, lecturer jobs. I can go profession by profession with you and show you that in each profession, we have equality at the bottom and men on top. Why? Let me suggest a number of factors. When I graduated from law school 4 years ago, 3 years ago, but who's counting? I was the first woman president of the Harvard Law Review. There was this long tradition. All of my predecessors went from clerkships where they first went to Judge J. Skelly Wright on the DC Circuit, and you worked for him for a year, and then you clerked for Justice William Brennan, the most liberal justice on the United States Supreme Court. So I show up for my first day of work with Judge Wright, who, both of these jobs you used to get sight unseen. All you needed to do, was to be president of the Law Review. I show up for my first day of work with Judge Wright, and Judge Wright calls me into his chambers and says, I have some bad news for you, but I don't want you to take it personally. I said, what is it? He said, Justice Brennan is not going to hire you, but don't take it personally. He's hiring your co-clerk from Chicago. I said, Justice Brennan never hires from Chicago. He went to Harvard. He doesn't like Chicago. You know, the conservatives at Chicago, liberals at Harvard in those days. I said, how can that be? He said, it's nothing personal. He just doesn't hire women. This is the guy who had written the opinion saying when we put women on the pedestal, we put them in the cage, right? I mean, where do you go to when the most liberal justice of the United States Supreme Court won't hire you because you're a woman? Now, I happened to go to Justice Stevens, which was fine. But I said to Judge Wright, I said, how can that be? How can he sit there, for those of you who are lawyers, and write Frontiero versus Richardson and all these wonderful cases full of this wonderful rhetoric about non-discrimination, and then not hire me sight unseen because I'm a woman? He said, it's nothing personal. He's a wonderful guy. He said, it's his secretary. His secretary likes it to be Justice Brennan and the boys, and her be the only woman in the chambers. And about 15 years later, what happened was that his wife died, and he married his secretary, and he started hiring women. And 10 years later, he died, and I started telling this story. But the point is that at least I knew I wasn't crazy. I did not sit there and say to myself, maybe I blew the interview, maybe I'm too tall or too short, maybe I talk too much, maybe I'm too loud or too noisy. When my students today ask me how I became a feminist, I have a very simple answer. You couldn't go to law school in the 1970s and not be a feminist. I mean, what could you do when you confront discrimination that is that explicit and that clear at every level? You either lose your mind or you say, I'm a feminist. Some would say both. These days, it doesn't work that way. These days, almost no one sits down and says, I think I won't hire her because she's a woman. Quite the contrary. People will tell you that they desperate to have just a few good women. Everybody wants women. But discrimination persists, and it's much more pernicious in many respects because it isn't clear or explicit. Let me tell you a story, again, and I love USC, the school I teach at now. This could happen anywhere, and I'll show you how it does happen anywhere, but it's just a little story that some of you will recognize. I was in my office one day, and my computer crashed. And it had crashed like 5 or 6 times. And this particular day I'm sitting there, my computer has crashed, I've got a column due, I've got to teach a class, I can't get on email. I can't believe it. What do I do? The computer crashes, I say, oh my God. I call computing, screaming now. I say, get up here, send somebody right away. So the guy comes up from computing, and that year I happen to have a male research assistant. His father happened to be the chief of police, very useful. And he's sitting there, and he looks at my computer, and he looks at the guy from computing, and he says, this computer is a real dinosaur. Oh, says the guy from computing, this is one of the oldest computers in the law school. I said, it is? He said, oh, yes. He said, we've upgraded almost everybody on the faculty. He said, this must be about the last one of, it's like a 186 in a year of Pentiums. He said, this must be about the oldest one any faculty member has. I'm sitting there saying to myself, my last name begins with an E, right? How could it possibly be, if I have a last name that begins with an E, if I'm among the most senior people here? I mean, even if you were doing it geographically, like going office to office, I'm sort of in the middle of the floor, right? Any system you would have in place for upgrading computers would not have me be last. So I say to the guy, you mean to tell me that everybody else here has a new computer but me? He said, just about. Well, what do? I did what any woman would do in that situation. I now pick up the phone and I really start to scream, okay? And what do they say of me at computing? They say what they say of any woman over 40 who's successful. Very difficult, right? But here's the truth. When I inquired to find out what system they had in place to decide who got the new computers, the answer was obvious. They had no system at all. If there'd been a system, I would have a new computer. Alphabetical, seniority, geography, the lottery, any system would not have left me last. In fact, what had happened was there was no system. So who got the new computers? First of all, the people who asked. Did I ask? No. Did it occur to me that I was entitled to a new computer? No. Had a number of the guys called screaming the minute the Pentiums came out and said, what am I doing with a 186? Yes, they got theirs first. Second, they went to people who it was assumed needed a new computer. People who crunched numbers. People who were thought to be computer literate. People who were thought to know a lot about computers. People who were male people. So that the combination of the question of who did the asking, who went out and said, I need and deserve a new computer, right? And who they assumed would say they needed and deserved a new computer if they knew that new computers were around, led them to give new computers to all of the guys and not to me. Now, what I did then, and this is really illustrative of my approach, because I'm not a believer in victimization, I'm a believer in power, is I did something very simple. First, I said I'd like a new computer within the next 20 minutes or I'm gonna, throw a fit. Second, I called the dean up, and I had an arrangement with the dean where I served on no committees, because I do all this outside work, and I raise money, etc. I said to the dean, you know that deal we have about my not serving on committees? He said, oh yeah, that's fine, because you raise money. But I said, forget it. I said, I want to be on the technology committee. I said, as a matter of fact, I'd like to be considered for chair of the technology committee. Now they call my office once a week, Professor Estrich, a new scanner. Right? How do you like that laser printer? We got you. I had lunch 2 weeks ago with a woman who started what is widely known as the major study of discrimination at MIT. This is a woman who is a microbiologist tenured at MIT. Now, 20 years ago, there were 8 tenured women in the School of Science at MIT. Imagine how good you have to be a tenured woman scientist at MIT. 20 years later, there were how many? 8 tenured women in the School of Science at MIT. And the way the public story goes, 3 of these women, none of whom thought of themselves as feminists, they're scientists, not feminists. They weren't victims of discrimination. They're scientists and they're tenured at MIT. Anyway, so the story goes, these 3 women got together and they realized a new lab building has just opened up, and they realized that none of them had any space in the new building. And they were chatting and realized that there was all this biotech money coming in, and maybe it was just a coincidence, but none of them had any of the biotech money coming in. And maybe it was also just a coincidence, but there were various professional committee assignments, etc. And they were comparing notes, and none of them had gotten these various assignments. And so, as the public story goes, it occurred to these 3 women with the light bulbs going off in their heads, perhaps, just perhaps, gender had had something to do with it. So they requested of the president of the university a scientific study. They said, we want you to do a scientific study of how, at the tenured level, we're not talking about the entry level, but at the tenured level, how decisions are made about lab space, grants, professional assignments, teaching loads, and the like. And a 2-year study was done, and the conclusion of the 2-year study was, just like my computer, that there was a systematic pattern in which all these various accoutrements of academic life that spell success in the long run went to men in disproportionate numbers, measurable differences. And they went to men because, first of all, the men asked and got. And second of all, the men who didn't ask were assumed to want and got. And the women who neither asked nor were assumed to want got nothing. And everybody was shocked at the study because a number of the administrators, of course, who were making these decisions were women. Now, the true story, of course, is just a teeny bit different. The true story is one woman figured out that there was something really rotten going on, because how could it possibly be that she got no biotech money? And then she talked to the other women and discovered that none of them did. And she threatened to sue MIT, and so they did a study. But it's such a much nicer story if we talk about 3 women just getting together and saying perhaps the light bulb is going to go out. But the point is the same. The point is that no one sat down and said, let's screw the smartest women in science in America. I mean, for anyone to sit down and say that would have been ridiculous. It was the unconscious patterns, the unconscious assumptions about what women want, about how ambitious we are, about what is enough, coupled with our own inability, unwillingness, timidity, the fact that we don't ask and demand. And the result was a measurable pattern in which the goodies, as it were, the promotions, the opportunities, the access you need to succeed and to break through to the very, very top were denied to women. Much of this, after all, is unconscious. It comes from issues of ambition in part, but also of comfort. A friend of mine described a scene in her office on a Friday afternoon where the guys were all sitting around discussing what they were going to do with their free time over the weekend. And they got to her and they said, well, what are you going to do with your free time over the weekend? And she thought to herself, she's married with 3 children, she thought, what is that? Free time. What is free time? She thought, I'm going to do everything I didn't do during the week that no one did for me. And it was just a complete disconnect. Was she going to play golf that weekend? No. How many women in this room play golf? Very bad. I have very bad news for you. Playing golf is one of the best things you can do, according to all the studies, to succeed in corporate America. There's only one problem. Most women don't play golf. And the women who do play golf tend to be women who don't work, which is convenient since the tea times for women are when women work. And so this whole culture in which, you get ahead in the golf course or at sporting events. I mean, no one sits down and says, let's discriminate against people who don't play golf. They just say, do you want to play golf on Saturday? And then they go off and play golf, and you've seen all the pictures with President Clinton and his golfing buddies, right? This is how we make connections and contacts. And women, by and large, I was doing some research, and this one woman who runs executive seminars said, what you got to do is play golf. I thought, it's too late for me, right? I can't learn now. I'm dead. I'll never make it onto corporate boards. And I was telling this story to a woman at one event, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, it's worse than that. I said, what do you mean? She said, I play golf. I said, good. She said, I play really well. I said, great. She said, not great. She said, the only thing worse than not playing golf is playing golf. Because when I say I want to play golf, they all look at me and think she's going to ruin the game. And then I convinced them that, no, I'm a really good golfer. And she says, and I realized that they don't really want to play golf. They just want to go out there and relax and talk dirty. So when she goes and plays golf, they can't enjoy themselves and relax and talk dirty and talk about, who's going to do what over the weekend or did or might. Or, as I used to say, golf is a substitute. We say we need sex and power. They have golf. Golf and power. And she said to me, it's really bad because in the socializing, they don't want her to come. And she ruins their time when she golfs. And she said to me, quite frankly, she doesn't have a good time either. So she doesn't have a good time. They don't have a good time. They all come back having had a miserable time. And she said to me, do you think this is helping my career? I said, probably not. I meet young women all the time in this environment who will tell me that they can't get traveling assignments with middle-aged men, and I understand why. Young women may be afraid of being sexually harassed, but no one is more afraid of sexual harassment than middle-aged men today. And they are afraid, I have to say, with some reason, that they will behave in a way that would be perfectly appropriate to someone like me, okay, who could use, you want to buy me dinner? Fine, I'm free. You want to open the door? Good, my hands are full. I mean, I don't have these issues anymore, right? But I do deal every day as a professor with 22-year-old women who will come to my office, and this is not typical, but it happens, and they will say, I think I'm being sexually harassed at work. And I'll say, really, what's happening? And they'll say, well, the guy asked me what I did over the weekend and whatever, opens the door, tells me I look nice. I mean, from where I sit, it sounds fine, okay? But to these young women, some of them, it's offensive. And I'll say to them, well, did you tell the guy that you found it offensive? Oh, no. You didn't? No. And I think to myself, the poor schlepper, all right? He doesn't have a clue, okay? His career could be ruined, and he doesn't have a clue. And, of course, I always say to them, go back and just, there's two words that are very magical to men. They kill desire right away. You just say sexual harassment, right? It's like saying, you don't say no, you say rape. It just kills desire. Very few men continue to have that passion in the face of the word rape. But these young women, many of them, some of you are young women here tonight, don't know that. And you have a generation of middle-aged men who will tell me in my interviews for my book, quite frankly, that they prefer not to travel with young women. That they just don't want to find themselves in a situation where if they say, come by and let's have a drink on the road, or let's go out to dinner, or let's catch a ball game, or whatever, that they could in any sense be vulnerable to sexual harassment. So you have this combination of unconscious factors and comfort. You're not going to get in trouble mentoring a guy who looks just like you. And if you don't have formal mentoring programs, and if you rely on informal programs, you're going to have a situation in which particularly younger women are not going to be picked up as mentorees. And if they're not being picked up by women on top, because there aren't any, and they're not being picked up by men on top because they view them as poison, then who's going to be taking care of them? A second issue. In addition to the unconscious discrimination that comes from assumptions about women, that comes from our own reluctance to ask for what we deserve, that comes from this definition of what's comfortable in corporate America, we have the dirty word, the M word, motherhood. I had a student a few years ago who came to me and said, I'm trying to decide, a former student, I taught at Harvard for 10 years, and this was one of my Harvard students, terrifically smart woman. She said, I'm trying to decide whether to come out to my law firm. She said, she's a lesbian. She said, I've been for years sitting there at every firm function. They say, are you bringing a date? She says, no. They say, do you want to get fixed up? She says, no. They say, you sure you don't want to get fixed up? No. Are you bringing a date? No. She said, how many years can I do this? She said, should I tell them the truth? So we go back and forth, and I'm a great believer. I don't tell anybody what to do. It's hard enough for me to fix, except my children, and they don't listen. So, I'm good there. Hard enough. But I just try to present the options. So finally I said to her, look, you don't want to spend your life in a place. I mean, how many years are we going to go through this? We've been going through this now for years, all right? Once a year you come to me and I have this conversation. At a certain point, if they're not going to accept you for who you are, why do you want to be there? So she says, all right. She gets her courage up. She calls up the two senior partners and says, I'd like to meet with you next week to discuss a matter of personal importance, a personal discussion. She walks into this meeting, these two guys looking incredibly uncomfortable. They don't want to be there. They're tapping their fingers. They're really unhappy about this. She sits down. She says, I'd like to discuss something personal with you. These are white shoe partners in a big shot law, big waspy law firm. She says, there's something I need to tell you. They both look at her, and she says, I'm a lesbian. There's a moment of silence. One turns to the other and says, a lesbian? She says, yes, I'm a lesbian. She's waiting for the reaction. One turns to the other and says, does that mean you're not having children? She said, well, as a matter of fact, she didn't plan to have children. If anyone had children, it would be her partner. One turns to the other and says, you're not pregnant? She said, no, she wasn't pregnant. She was a lesbian. Big smiles break onto their faces. Lesbian. Nice, says one to the other. That's nice, right? Does that mean you don't have children? She said, right, that means I don't have children. They said, that's fabulous. We're delighted, right? Thrilled. They walk out of the room saying lesbians are wonderful, particularly the ones who don't have children. I tell the story. I mean, absolutely true. She called me up afterwards. She said, all they cared about was that I wasn't pregnant. I said, right. Children, family values are all well and good when it's someone else's family. I mean, these were socially conservative guys, but it didn't matter. If you're looking for someone to bill 2,300 hours a year, chances are you're not looking for a mother. The reality in modern work life is that the expectations keep going up and up and up. And there are some women, I'm told, who can bill 2,300 to 2,500 hours a year and raise kids with their left hands. I think I'm good. I can't do it, okay? Not only can I not do it, but I wouldn't want to do it. I didn't do it. I don't want to do it. I used to say before I had children that all I needed in life was a wife, right? That if only I had a wife, I was very busy on the road, running campaigns, it was all dandy. I just needed a wife to have the children and raise the children. Then a funny thing happened. I had the children, and I didn't want someone to raise them for me. I didn't stop working, mind you, but I wanted to raise them myself. And nothing I've done in my life has given me more pleasure, more satisfaction, more frustration, or taken up more time than my children. And if you said to me that I could trade it all, that I could have somebody who would raise them and I could still work 100 hours a week, et cetera, I'll be perfectly honest, I didn't want that. I wanted the flexibility and the balance. And I didn't pretend that you could have it all at once, but I wanted to be able to be a real parent to my children. And you can't do that if you're billing 2,500 hours a year. You just can't. So what do we do about that? There are two possibilities. One would be that we would say, how can we make the workplace flexible enough to accommodate women and men during that period of life when the demands of children are at their greatest? Because if you think of a work career as being 40 or 50 years long, and you think of the intense period of child raising as being, what, 10 or 15 or 18 years, you might say, if you were taking one step back, that the challenge would be, how do we accommodate the needs of parenting and families during that time? But that's not what we do. What we do increasingly is an either-or proposition. And the either-or proposition that leads women to be real estate brokers is the one that says, you can have your kids and go on the mummy track, and you never get back. It's not a detour, it's a dead end. And you don't come back at 45 and get to the top at that point. You come back at 45 and you lie about how old you are, and you lie about your children, and you end up in a low-level job with no future. And it's completely wrong, but there it is. And what's worse is we have a generation of young women who don't even see that as discrimination. They see that as opportunity. Every year I ask my law students in my gender discrimination class, I say, what percentage of you want to be partners in law firms or corporate counsel or whatever it is in the next 10 years? And virtually every male hand goes up. Every single one, every year. There'll be one guy who says, I'm going to be a stay-at-home dad. But basically all the guys raise their hand. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, men with children make the most money in our society. Who makes the least money? Women with children. And this year, for the first time, not one woman raised her hand to say yes in answer to the question, who wants to be a corporate partner or a senior counsel or the like? And the reason they didn't raise their hands was very simple. They all said to me, you can't do that and have kids. And I want to have kids. I don't want to have a life in which all I do is work. Or as some young women are constantly saying to my friends, I don't want your life. Nothing is more satisfying than having a young woman say to you, I don't want your life. And you're like, what's wrong with it? It's not so bad. So I work 100 hours a week and have no support. Still, it's what I wanted, okay? They don't want it. I was seated, it was about a year and a half ago, I came to speak at NYU at the Law Review dinner, and I was seated next to the woman president of the NYU Law Review. And I said, what are you going to do? And she said, I'm a little bit older, so I'm going to go to, I think it was Paul Weiss, but it doesn't matter, a big law firm here in town for a couple of years, and then I'm going to leave because I want to have children. And I thought to myself, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy of how the vicious cycle works. From the day she gets there, everyone will know that she plans to leave in a couple of years. So if you're on the she won't get on the fast track, she won't get the best assignments. She'll be in the second tier, as they say. And then it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. She will leave, and they'll say, see, women leave. And once she's gone, she's gone. And I told that story in Berkeley, and a man raised his hand, and he said to me, well, if you were the male law firm partner, wouldn't you want the guy to work for you in that circumstance? I mean, who would you rather have work for you? A guy who'll work 100 hours a week because he figures his future and his career is there, or a woman who is already planning how she's going to leave to have children, even though it's with a guy she hasn't met yet to have children. She, the family, a lot of my students are compromising their careers for these guys they haven't met yet, and I'm always saying, well, you can't be sure. Maybe you should wait to meet them first. But the point was, wouldn't you rather have the 100-hour-a-week worker than the one who is already ready to compromise in the future? And my answer was very simple. Why don't you want them both? Why don't we come up with the means to accommodate that woman? Because I'll tell you what'll happen. The man will leave for a better job. You accommodate that woman and she's yours forever. She'll never leave. She probably should leave, but she won't. between loyalty and the recognition that it's hard to get that kind of flexibility anywhere else. If you can accommodate her, she's yours forever. So why don't we? And I would say that a big part of the answer has to do with us. Women today have more power than we have ever had, and we don't use it. Too many of the women who have made it suffer from what I call only woman in the room syndrome, which is to say, if they get in the room, they figure if they act just like a man, perhaps people won't notice that they have breasts. And I want to tell you, it doesn't work that way. They do notice. And what's even more important, if you get in the room that way, it seems to me you have an obligation to help other women. When I was a first-year law student at Harvard, there was a grand total of one woman tenured at Harvard Law School. And she had been tenured because she had been a research fellow for 16 years. And EEOC, remember EEOC used to be one of those organizations that actually did something? Anyway, EEOC came breathing down Harvard's back and said, we want a census. It's an important thing. Forcing people to collect information is incredibly important and usually enough to make change. So they said to Harvard, we want to know how many women you have tenured on your faculty. So Harvard did what any fine liberal institution would do. It looked around and it reclassified all the librarians as tenured professors. Now they were tenured professors without power, without privilege, without voting rights, okay? But it called all the librarians tenured professors. And they submitted those numbers to EEOC, and in those days it didn't work. And the EEOC came back and said, they are not the same. So the law school, which was one of many schools at that time with a zero, if they didn't count librarians, had to go find a woman. And sure enough, under a rock, they found a woman who'd been there 16 years, was the world's authority in her field, and had never been promoted. And they promoted her to tenure. She's now dead too, which is why I tell this story also. But anyway, they promote her to tenure. And I'm part of this group of first-year women law students who are activists. And we go see her, and we say to her, Professor Owens, many of us are going to go, we're all going to go through 3 years here without ever having a woman professor. And that's not good for the women, and it's even worse for the men. So tell us what we can do to get more women on the faculty. And she said that classic line that makes you want to strangle somebody. She said, there are no women qualified to teach at Harvard Law School. And in fact, I'm told she voted for me. I'm not sure. But if she did, I was the only woman she ever voted for, because she was a consistent vote against women. I'm here to tell you, I call that being a traitor. She was there in that position because other women had fought hard to force Harvard to confront the discrimination. And it would be nice to be alive in the day when women were free to be as selfish and ignorant as men have always been. But we are not there yet. And so long as women get to the table because of the struggles of other women, and so long as they do so in a context in which other women's paths are so darn difficult, it seems to me that we who have gotten power, who have gotten in the room, have an obligation as women to help other women get there. And if we see that obligation and take it seriously, there is nothing we can't do. I want to tell you one or two more stories and then take some questions. But one is the story of how Madeleine Albright got to be Secretary of State, because it is instructive in a way of this whole idea of women's power and what we can do if we use our power. Now, Madeleine and I have been friends for 20 years because we used to get excluded from all the same meetings together. So we would be sitting outside saying, you know, is something happening tonight that we're not at? Yeah, usually where we'd eat dinner. Madeleine, as you know, served 4 years as UN ambassador. And her chief of staff was a woman named Elaine Shokus. Now, let me take a step back here. Betty Curry, who had since become famous, used to work for me in 1984. She was the woman who answered the phone in the Ferraro campaign. So every woman above a certain age, like mine, in Democratic politics, knew Betty. And we had discovered early on in the Clinton administration that there were two ways to get to the president. One was to go through the boys and channels, and it took forever. And the other, as the president said to me early on, was just call Betty. Unfortunately, when I heard the Monica story and I heard that she'd gone through Betty, I knew. Anyway, but that comes later. Secretary of State opens up. And I call Elaine Shokus, my old friend. Funny how Madeline was always able to find qualified women, even though foreign policy had been considered the priesthood by the guys. I call up Elaine and I say, Elaine, are we running a campaign for Madeline to be Secretary of State? And she says, oh, no. I said, do you want me to call Betty and I'll talk to the president and write a column and I'll get Pam to do this. And we've got Ann Lewis with Hillary and we've got Elaine Karimark with Gore and we could... She said, we're not running a campaign. Doesn't this sound like women? She said, we're not running a campaign. The president knows Madeline. He's going to make this decision. He knows she's interested. There's no need for a campaign. Well, I got 3 jobs, 2 kids. What do I need, another campaign? I say, fine. I hang up the phone. Nobody does anything. About a week later, George Stephanopoulos was running a campaign for George Mitchell of Maine to be Secretary of State. And he gives an interview to the Washington Post, not for attribution. He gives an interview in which he gives to the Washington Post the short list of candidates for Secretary of State. And there were either 4 or 5 of them, and they are all men. And the intrepid reporter, unlike the Time AOL story, at least has the presence of mind to hear this list of George Mitchell and this guy and this guy and this guy and say, but what about Madeline? And the quote is, according to a senior White House aide, Madeleine Albright is in the, quote, second tier. This appears on the front page of the Washington Post, and all hell breaks loose. I mean, we all see this, quote, second tier. At this point, no one asks permission. I call Betty, Pam calls Betty. I write a column, Elaine Kmart goes to Gore, Ann Lewis goes to Hillary. Various people begin screaming bloody murder at this incredible insult to Madeline. And within the week, who is Secretary of State? Madeline. So I run into Madeline about a week later at a party. It was a wonderful experience. I said, Madeline, do we have new perfume on? Because here we are, she and I, just like the old days, except now all these guys who never invited us to meetings are like sucking up, right? It was really quite pleasurable. Oh, hi, Susan. Hi, Madeline. How are you? We're dandy. We're the same 2 girls you used to not talk to. Anyway, they're busily crowding around us, and it's extremely pleasant because she's the most powerful person in the room. And she laughs, and she says to me, it was the second-tier business that did it. I never would be Secretary of State had it not been for that second-tier business. And I think it's true. Because had it not been for the second-tier business, we wouldn't have made the phone calls, wouldn't have written the columns, wouldn't have gone to Gore and to Hillary and to this one and to that, and wouldn't have mounted the kind of campaign that was far more effective because she had far more support than any. But the point is, we had the power all along to do it. We had the access, we had the influence, we had the connections, and we just weren't going to do it. I mean, since when do I need permission to make a phone call? Why did we ask permission? Why did we feel like we couldn't do it? Why did it take stepping on our faces one more time for us to use the power we had all along to make a difference? The fact of the matter is that in America today, women and the men who agree with us, because I don't believe in gender wars, have more power than we have ever had in our history. In terms of economic power, in terms of the dollar, I can tell you story after story, little things. I wrote a column one day about United Airlines not having any woman on its board, and how if for just one day, business women chose to fly another airline, we could have an enormous impact. Just little old me writes this column in USA Today, and what happens within 2 weeks? Miracle of miracles, United Airlines finds under a rock Hazel O'Leary, former energy secretary, black, woman, golfer, and puts her on the board. I went to Al Gore at a certain point. It's tough. I mean, I hate doing it. Because as women, many of us, we want to be liked. We want to be nice. We don't want to be confrontational. My friend Ann Lewis and I had decided that because in this last campaign, neither of us wanted anything, we would take it upon ourselves to make sure there were women at the table. And to my great surprise, quite honestly, it turned out to be difficult. I kept calling the princes, and people don't give away power that easily. And it wasn't conscious, it was unconscious, it was selfish, it was whatever it was. The bottom line was we were getting nowhere. And so somebody said to me, you need an organization. So I created a smoke and mirrors organization. I said to my friend Lynn Wasserman, you are now the chairman of the Caucus of Democratic Women. She said, what is it? I said, it's nothing. All right? I said, they tell me I need an organization to get women to the table. Fine, I got one. You're chairing it. She said, who's on the board? I said, who are you having lunch with this week? We created a smoke and mirrors group. Actually, it was a lot of fun. Women started calling me and saying, I understand you have a new organization with no meetings, no dues, right? A lot of power comes from all you. Why didn't? And they were insulted. Why didn't you call me? I'll be on your board. I mean, I had the mayor's wife calling me to say, "What? She didn't need me?" I said, "I need you. I need you. Believe me, I need you." And when that didn't work, Lynn said to me, "You created the organization. Now write a column about it." So I wrote a column that, by the way, I never even published. It was enough. It got the vice president's attention. He yelled at me on the phone for half an hour, which I found to be exceedingly unpleasant, all right? I held my stomach. It's the key to exercising power, I have concluded, particularly if you're a woman, is Tums, all right? If you take your Tums and are willing, he yelled at me for a half an hour, and then he hired 5 women that week. And they each would leave me a message on the phone saying, Susan, I don't really know you, but thanks. Bing. Don't tell anyone I know you, but thanks, right? I'm not making this call, but thanks. And I thought to myself, all it took in that case was my willingness to have somebody get really angry at me and endure a stomachache with 1 or 2 of my other women friends, the willingness to put ourselves on the line for others, and we could make a difference. There is not an institution in American society that doesn't have 3 women who aren't powerful enough with outside forces to make a difference. I'll tell you about my most recent campaign, and then I'll stop. I have a friend who was a columnist for the LA Times, the only woman columnist for the LA Times. And she came over to my house last fall to do a story on me for the Ladies' Home Journal about my book. And I said, Pat. I said, new fellows coming in from Chicago. The Tribune Company had bought the LA Times. I said, what's going to happen to your column? She says, oh, I'm sure I'll be fine. I said, did you read my book? She said, oh, yeah. I said, are we running a campaign for you? She said, oh, no campaign is necessary. I thought, famous last words. I said, well, I don't know. I said, you're the only woman. There's a bunch of guys coming in. There are no women in senior positions in this company. Are you sure you don't need anything? She said, I'm sure everything will be fine. About a week later, somebody was on vacation, and her column ran on page A3. And I wrote a letter to the editor of the LA Times. Nice letter. As I say, I'm the nice feminist. This is the first part of the story. I say, what a delight it was to wake up this morning and find my friend Pat Morrison on A3, and what a treat since no woman appears on page A3. And I get this very nice letter back saying, oh, glad for your interest, and yada yada. Cut to the chase. Last week, she says to me, you were right. I said, what do you mean you were right? I said, here's this woman who's been with this paper 20 years, near tears. She said, how did you know? I said, how did I know what? She said, how did you know, you'll pardon my French, that they were going to do me in? They were moving her to the weather page. Now, you have to, it really is funny, because if you're from LA, no one reads the weather page. I mean, at least out here, there is weather, and people are interested. Do you know what the weather is in LA? Same as yesterday, right? It's the same every day. No one reads. Earthquakes we have, but weather is the same. It's lovely. Nobody reads the weather page. To be opposite the weather page is like to be in Siberia. And she says to me, and then I get these other calls from women at the paper saying, they're doing in the one-woman columnist. I said, not without a fight from yours truly. So I dash off a letter to my new best friend, the editor to whom I had written a few months before. I say, remember me? Right? I said, basically say it ain't so, Joe. Is this happening? I said, because, if it is happening, I can think of no better theme for this and this and this. To make a long story short, he sent me back this letter saying, perhaps his judgment was skewed by his maleness, said he to me, not realizing how many people were going to see this particular letter. He said, but he in fact had gone out. He was going to run the best columns they had, including some they didn't even have that they had never seen, but were going to go out and hire. And he in fact, in this somewhat snotty way, and I, being the nice feminist that I am, had suggested to him that I couldn't really believe this was true because I looked at the paper and I thought to myself, how many men shop at White Sales, right? You look at the front section of a newspaper, and what are there? Clinique bonuses, okay? How many of you fellows are in line for those Estee Lauder bonus days, right? Anyway, I've been on this campaign for a week. These people really, I don't know, did he think I was kidding? The LA Times book fair was last Sunday. My panel was called Whatever Happened to the Women's Movement? What did I do? And I was on C-SPAN. I took out my copy of the paper and I read his name and address over and over again on C-SPAN, suggesting that women should get in touch. I then did it again in my panel discussion with hundreds of women in the room, and these women are, sometimes we're our own worst enemies. They were all on my left, okay? I try to make the point that, going to my left is not going to a place where there's a big crowd. So they're debating, from the left whether to ever use the word motherhood, okay? Irrelevancy upon irrelevancy. And there I am with my newspaper, okay, showing the 5 men columnists. I have a copy here too. And my poor friend Pat. I've now got the head of advertising at Southwest Airlines calling this man. I've got the mayor leading the crusade with me. If any of you are in the advertising business, federated, I'm going after board members, I'm having a little fun. But the point of this story is they expected nothing. They are amazed and shocked that there seem to be hundreds of women out there, including some who are in a position to actually put advertising in their newspaper, who would actually care about what would happen to a woman columnist. And my friend Pat now calls me the one-woman Underground Railroad. And I'm having an excellent time. I'm writing a piece about it for USA Today. They're very interested. I couldn't do it for myself. I really couldn't. But I can do it for her. And someday she could do it for me. And we can do it for each other. And my point is a very simple one. The power is at our fingertips. It requires some tums. It requires some guts. We can't always do it for ourselves. But if we can do it for each other, we can make this world a much better place for ourselves and for our sons and daughters. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, thoughts? Their names are John Perner, by the way, P-U-E-R-N-E-R. I got him in Dallas last week. I hit up a number of women in the advertising, and John Carroll of the Los Angeles Times. I just love the notion that as I travel around the country, they get letters. And it's like, what is this woman doing? I'm going to Belgrade next week. God knows what I'll do when I get there, all right? I can just see some crazy Yugoslavs writing to the LA Times, what is happening to Pat Morrison? It's Pat Morrison. But it's the possibility of change. Questions, thoughts, comments? Way in the back, yes. Yes, you. They change the list every year, have you noticed? Right. 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 But you can make it happen. Right, right, right. No, no, no. I understand. How do we harness the power? How do we move people forward? All different ways. I script people sometimes. Okay? I script them. I tell them what to say. And I tell them that if one person says it, they're a troublemaker. But if 10 people say it, you can't remember who said it, you have a problem. When I was in law school, I used to always walk into law firm interviews and say, I'd like to meet with the women partners. It was a joke line. I knew what the answer was. They would look at me and say, but we don't have any women partners. And I would say, you don't? Oh no, I must have signed up by mistake. And I would leave. And I would try to get, and of course I had such high grades that I could get away with this kind of bad behavior. But I would try to get as many women and men as I could to sign up for interviews with law firms with no women partners that they didn't want to work for, so they could walk in and say, I'd like to meet with the women partners. I had one occasion in New York where this poor sick woman had to come in, and I said, what's the matter? She said, you said you wanted to meet with the women partners. And she was sick as a dog. But the point is, I now say to my students, particularly if you don't want to be a law firm partner, go in there and say, I want to meet with the part-time partners. Okay? I want to meet them. There aren't any, all right? In most law firms, there aren't any. But one of the reasons there aren't any is because they feel no competitive need to have any. And if you were to go to a Harvard Law School and 50 women, I go to Harvard to speak, I say, go in there. And they say, we don't want to be, fine, especially if you don't want to be partners. Go in there and say, I want to meet with the part-time partners. And if they hear that all day long, guess what? They'll go back and say, maybe it would be a good idea to have some part-time partners. I mean, ask. I now do these email campaigns. We have technology at our fingertips. When I got annoyed last Wednesday night, when I got home and found out what they were doing to Pat Morrison, and I sent off my letter and I got my response, what did I do? I sent it to 150 women and some men. And I said, look, all you have to do, you don't have to be me, all right? You don't have to be the one who they're going to hate, okay? They're going to blame me. All you have to do is write a letter, write a fax, make a phone call, define what you can do. Not everybody can do the same things, but there is safety in numbers. The troublemaker, I'll take on the role of the troublemaker. You join my organization, okay? You send an email, you send a fax, make a phone call. You don't want to write the letter, send the fax, send the letter, right? Use your dollars wisely. I mean, why don't we have information about what the good companies are? And when we go shopping, reward good behavior, punish bad behavior. I got mad last year. Do you know that Walmart will not stock the morning after pill. They have made a business decision not to stock the morning after pill. Now, they stock Viagra, all right? They won't stock it. If women were just able for a day to say we'll cross the street and go to Thrifty or Rite Aid, we'll send a letter saying I'm not shopping at Walmart. We'll get 20 of us together and sign the letter. And you know, the funny part of it is it's fun. I mean, that's the joke of it all. It's fun. I go to college campuses now a lot where there's no politics at all. And I try to convince these young people that it was actually a lot of fun in the old days. We used to make trouble. We used to have a good time. I mean, we got to meet guys this way. I mean, it was all right. I go to these men's groups and I say, you have my idea. The John Stuart Mill Society, the men's bake sale for women's rights. I said, it's a dating opportunity if that's what you want. You know, get the men to bake and auction the baked goods. I sold that in Utah last week. They thought, I mean, they were a little bit behind. They thought it was the best idea. You don't have to be unattractive and obnoxious to be a feminist, you know? You can have a lot of fun. But I think we have to, those of us who are feisty, and I am, have to not expect everybody to do just what we're gonna do. I mean, Catalyst thinks I like Catalyst enormously, but they're nicer than I am, all right? They want the men on the boards to like them, so fine. The men on the boards can like them. You can be nice to Catalyst or you can deal with me. And if you don't like me, then you can deal with Gloria Allred, all right? We have this, you know, progression, and we each play our different roles. I am medium nice, all right? I'm not quite as nice as Catalyst, but I'm not quite as nasty as Gloria. And if you don't like me, you'll get next. So I think we've got to keep our sense of humor. We've got a script. The mayor called me in this little campaign I'm doing with him, and he literally said to me, what do you want me to say? I said, I want you to call the publisher of the LA Times and tell him that I am his nightmare come true. That you can't control me, right? That I am utterly out of control on this one. That I will stop at nothing, right? That I have taken this as a personal vendetta, right? Because he'll believe it, hearing it from another guy. He'll go, oh my God, she's a nutball, right? What am I gonna do in this one? I said, I don't care what he thinks of me. What's he gonna do? You know? There've got to be some of us who are willing, so we'll think I'm a nut. You know, better to be feared than loved sometimes. I used to be well-liked by a lot of guys who did nothing for me. Then I started taking them on, and now they like me less. They listen more. The Gore campaign, which, that was my Rubicon, because that was my side and my team. And sometimes you have to be willing, and I was writing this book, and I thought to myself, how can I write this book saying that other women should stand up there and take risks when I am not willing to do it myself? And I did it myself, and it was a very funny scene. I mean, there I am taking on Al Gore, and he's yelling at me, and it's the very weekend I'm taking my children to Washington for a visit to the White House. And I say to them, let's go to the beach instead, and they say no. So I'm walking around the White House like, uh-oh, what if I run into him? And of course, I was in terrible fear because he had told me I'd betrayed him. Our relationship would never, this column had never even appeared at this point. And I walk in, and Ann Lewis comes up from upstairs and says to me, you must speak to the president about this. I said, Ann, there is a war in Kosovo. You want me to speak to the president about the vice president being mad at me about no women in the campaign? I mean, I think it's an important issue, but there is a war. Are things that bad? She said, that bad. And I walk into the Oval Office with my poor kids who are like, ooh, I say, we got to be last, and I got to speak to the president. Blah, blah. And I walk up to the president, and I finally say to him, I said, your friend, the vice president, is a little mad at me. And he looks at me, this is the next day, and he says to me, I know. I said, you know? He said, oh, yeah. He said, he came in this morning to complain to me about you. I said, about me? He said, yeah. I said, what did you say? He said, I said to him, Al, stop kvetching about Susan. She's just trying to help. Well, wipe me off the floor. There I am eating my Tums, and all it took was my willingness to take him on to get that. And then the president says to me, so let's solve this. I said, okay, let's, Sure, find powerful male allies. That's another thing I do. I much prefer running a campaign at this level. I'll pick off men. The mayor wants to help me, great. He can be the hero, I'll be the bad guy. I say, you tell the publisher of the Washington Post, of the LA Times, that maybe if you move her to page A3, you might be able to get me, the crazy woman, to back off. So I'll give men chances to be heroes. I mean, it's politics, it's strategy. But we've got to be willing to recognize that there's all different ways to skin a cat and that we just have to keep at it. And then I only have one requirement, which is that everyone I help, and I help a lot of people, I say to them, you have only one requirement. I don't want anything, but I'm going to send you women. Once I help you get to a certain place, I'm going to send you women, and I expect you to take care of them. And that's all I ask. And I have to be very honest. I find it very satisfying. I travel around the country, and I think there is nothing more satisfying that I do. If you view your life as a blessing, the ability to be willing to go out in the line for other people. Maybe I sound like a girl here, but I find it to be the best thing I do. So, I'm selfish in a way. So they end up thinking I'm a feisty, obnoxious girl. I figure I'll go to heaven for it, and I'll be surrounded by all these women and men I've gotten jobs for. Yes?
My name's Patty Seller. I'm actually running for election.
Oh, goody. See?
That's just well represented here. I actually, pardon me. Yeah, frankly, we've never thought of that. It's an interesting suggestion. I do this most powerful women story each year, which is started in 1998.
I only laugh because I've been going back 25 years looking at those stories and trying to figure out what happened to all those powerful women in 78 and 88.
I'm actually curious what you think of that package that we do every year. I'd be interested in your opinion. I'd love your honest opinion. This question actually doesn't have to do with women in business. I'm real curious what your feeling is about the women in the Bush White House.
I've been looking at this. This is a really interesting thing. I've just been pulling, my friend Dottie Lynch, who works for CBS News, has been pulling for me the underlying exit poll numbers from this last election, because Democrats lost the married woman's vote. We really did. And I think it is really troubling. I think it's great that Bush is surrounded. The Bush White House doesn't work the same hours as the Clinton White House, and he's got more mothers in there than ever were there for Clinton. And I think that's great for him. And I think it's a real indictment of my side of the aisle that we didn't have as many. I think that what happened in the last election, for all the talk about the gender gap, when you look underneath the gender gap, Democrats won the votes of single and unmarried women and working women. But married women and women with children and women who weren't working were voting for George W. Bush. And as a Democrat, I think that is at least in part because we didn't go after them the way we should have. We didn't speak to them. We didn't go after them. We let the traditional cleavages among women get in the way. What defeated I'm old enough to remember the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. And what defeated the Equal Rights Amendment was not men, but women. It was traditional women who feared what working women were going to do to them. And I think so long as we allow those cleavages to go unaddressed, and we do on our side, we end up every fall in the Democratic side looking for the hunters, not the mothers. And we don't get the hunters, and we ignore the mothers. And I think George W. Bush, with Karen Hughes and this Margaret LaMontagne and Condi Rice and others, have more women around him, and it helps him. And if you look at the numbers, he was getting women's votes. And I spoke this morning to Susan Blumenthal, who happens to be the top woman at HHS for women's health. And she said it's very interesting. They've separated out the issue of reproductive health, which they won't touch. But the rest of the women's health agenda, they're giving tremendous support to because they're smart. And that is smart. And having a lot of women in that White House is smart. Now, you look at the individual women. Karen Hughes is a mother. Her husband retired and stays at home to take care of their son. I mean, it's not a typical situation. It's the Carly Fiorina thing of, here's Carly Fiorina as the head of Hewlett Packard, and she stands up and says gender had nothing to do with her career or her success. And I thought, God, that's amazing. How could that be? And then I look and she says she's been able to balance family and blah, blah, blah. And I think to myself, well, wait a minute. She got married when her husband's two daughters were, 15 and 13, and she says she was like a mother to them. Like a mother is different than a mother. Missing ages 1 through 13 miss a lot of work, all right? I mean, let's just be honest here, okay? If I was like a mother, I would be like a lot more successful, all right? Second, her husband took early retirement at the age of 52 because he realized her career was more promising than his. And that if one of them didn't take early retirement, then they would never see each other and the bills would get paid. How many of us in this room are married to men who took early retirement so that they could support our careers? And I think the problem right now, if you want to, on the business coverage issue, is we tend to have these sugar-coated stories like, isn't everything wonderful? Here are 10 powerful women. And what we don't do, I went back and looked at all the, because we've been doing these stories, not you, but Fortune and Forbes have been doing these stories for 20 years, about 20 women who'll be running Fortune 500 companies in the next 10 years. And then 5 years later, there's another story about 20 women who'll be running Fortune 500 companies in the next 10 years. And no one ever goes back and says, what happened to the 20 women from 1978, the 20 women from 1980, the 20 women from 1982? I mean, none of them ended up running Fortune 500 companies, not a one. And most of the women who make these most powerful lists end up going down the tubes. And I think there is, my question that I really started with at that conference of how we deal with issues of race and gender, there is insufficient sensitivity to the existence of double standards. There's a sort of cheerleader aspect in the press that says, isn't this wonderful? Carly Fiorina, nothing to do with gender. And nobody steps back and says, well, what are you talking about? Nothing to do with gender. You had no parenting responsibilities. You had a husband who took early retirement. Your life had nothing to do with gender. I mean, I'm delighted for you. But the other women will tell you that if you do have parenting responsibilities and you don't have a husband who takes early retirement, then gender's going to have a hell of a lot to do with your progress. And so I think that's really the problem. Even the Linda Wachner story in today's New York Times, I don't know how many of you read that story. Now, whatever one thinks of Linda Wachner, I found it so interesting. I have never read a story about a male CEO being too tough. Okay? And there was no analysis in that story of the extent to which, if at all, the considerations of toughness are gender related. That her, her compensation package, they made a huge deal about. I mean, here is one woman out of a million who demanded decent compensation, and she's getting killed for it. Was it truly excessive? I don't know. But I do know, having studied the academic literature, that there is, in effect, a vise of how women have to be to succeed in corporate America. And for women, toughness and aggressiveness as a whole set of issues where we are judged differently than men. And, I have, as probably some of you in this room, we walk this line. And if we are tough, I am not that tough. But by a woman's standard, I'm really tough, which makes me probably too tough. But, you can't be too male. To be a male, to embrace male characteristics is consistent with success. For women, it's this fine line. And I think that in our efforts to, celebrate the accomplishments of women who do achieve, I am struck by the Pollyanna-ish cheerleading aspect of reporting every time a woman succeeds, and by the inattention to issues of gender when a woman fails. And I think we need to do better, but it's very hard. Yes. And because many of them isn't not true, didn't make it. I mean, if you're 55, if you look, I look every day at the promotions in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal because I track ages. And what's depressing now is they're 43 and 44 and 45, these guys who are hitting the top. And if you're 55 and you have gotten stuck, as so many women have, I talk to these women one-on-one, and they'll say, look, I'm not going to make it. I'm now at the point where I'm too old. And age discrimination is a huge factor for women in particular because of career interruptions that combine with age discrimination to leave you at 55 being, if you don't take the buyout package, they're afraid that they're going to be fired the next day. Right. Right. And they make no trouble, which is how they get number 9 and number 10. I know. And they're not making any trouble, which is my problem with them. You know, that's my problem with some of these women. They are being counted. It's like the Ann Jordan phenomenon. How many black women are on boards in America? 87. Ann Jordan, 42. Juanita Krebs, 41. I mean, you know, you get the same 2 women sitting on 10 boards, which I wouldn't object to as much if they would make a little trouble. But they don't make any trouble. And they're in a position, you know, I've been doing some consulting in the corporate side since I've been separated, and I have found it's amazing how easy it is to make trouble in corporate America. All you got to do is find a woman in HR, and they're all in HR, let's be honest, and say, get me some numbers. And you know, you find out that the women are doing better in Eastern Europe than in Orange County. And it's very telling, because in America today, the public, if you can get the numbers out there, you're halfway there. But these women, my frustration with some of these women we put on boards, and that's why I tell the Elizabeth Owens story, is that when they get in the room, the first thing they should do is get 2 more women there. There should not be just 1 woman on any board. There should be 2 women or 3 women, but they don't. They sit there with only woman in the room syndrome, and they think if I'm really well behaved, then I'll get the reputation of a, quote, good board member, and I'll get on lots of boards. Well, what difference does it make if you're doing nothing on any of them, except serving as, you know, a picture on the wall? And my point is, if you're in the room, make demands. I've started studying the whole executive search business, all right? Which, if ever there were an old boys network, it is that. I believe that women who are on boards have an obligation when a search firm comes in with 5 men to say, no, inadequate. But they don't. And that's, you know, so what's the point of power if you don't use it? And my argument to these women is we got to script them too. And I did a thing last week for an international executive search firm that was sponsoring me, mind you. but that has no women partners? Hello? If you have no women partners, who's doing the top level searches? Men. Who are they coming up with? Other men. Does anybody get in trouble that way? No. And we've got to be willing, those of us who are in these positions, don't go quietly into the night, I say to these 55-year-old women. Before you take the buyout, if you're gonna take the buyout, for goodness sakes, make trouble before you leave. It doesn't even matter anymore. You're going out. So go out with a bang. But our politeness and good behavior. I mean, what's the point of going quietly into the night when you can go noisily into the night and make a difference? And the reality is, the truth is, that if you get a little bit noisy, they can't deny you. I mean, that's the joke of it all, is that once you go public, or once you even threaten to go public, you have much more power than you do when you are quietly and nicely taking your buyout and disappearing and never to be heard from again. But we've got to support each other in doing so. And as some of you know, the first time you do it, the first time you throw off that good girl mentality, I don't care if you're 20, 40, 60, or 80, the first time you do it, it's like, ooh, right? They're going to get mad at me. So what? Yes. Right. I love it. I do those numbers too, right? How many women commit acts of sexual harassment, right? Right. They show up every day. They're not hungover, They don't harass anybody. When was the last time you read about a woman who embezzled from her company, committed fraud? I mean, the whole way we calculate value and contributions is skewed against women because we don't count those factors. And we don't take into account that they tend to be healthier, less likely to have heart attacks, less likely to get drunk, less likely to commit acts of sexual harassment, less likely to commit acts of fraud, insider trading. I mean, the whole long list. Indeed, I often say that if it was any group other than women, we'd see this all clearly. But we are all so accustomed to downvaluing or devaluing women, to accepting their departures, to accepting the literal migration of women out of the workforce that we don't even notice it, much less simply see it as a problem to be solved. I should probably, yes, stop right here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.